Welcome to a special video presentation of ACTEC Trust and Estate Talk, a podcast series created for wealth and estate management professionals by the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel, or ACTEC, and funded by the ACTEC Foundation. This is Susan Snyder, ACTEC Fellow from Chicago. Estate Planning and Trust Management for a Brave New World. It's All in the Family. What's a Family? Was a lecture presented to the college by Fellow Hugh Magill of Chicago during ACTEC's annual meeting in March of 2018. Hugh has given us permission to share his full, live video presentation and corresponding slides with our audience.
I was introduced to this family 6 or 8 years ago by the chairman of my company. The husband was a retired CEO of several major American corporations. He was divorced and remarried. His wife was a successful professional. They look like a fairly typical blended American family. 3 children of the first marriage, 2 children of the second. And on the family tree, they look like a 2-generation family. Demographically, however, it's a 4-generation family, owing to the differences in the eras in which the members were born and raised. Family structure presents some challenges in estate planning, the allocation of financial wealth, which we'll explore a little bit later. This mixture of 4 generations, a traditionalist, a boomer, Gen Xers, and millennials in one family, is one of several encounters that led to the research that forms the foundation for today's presentation. So let's turn first and consider the attributes of the generations whom we serve as clients today. From the greatest generation, largely shaped our traditional estate planning paradigm, to millennials, who are reshaping expectations and norms in a number of eras. The attributes and characteristics that I will share this morning of the generations are drawn from many sources. The Pew Research Center, an invaluable source of insight into these things in Washington, D.C. Paul Taylor's work, The Next America, research data from the Census Bureau, the National Institutes of Health. They are, of course, broad generalizations, and I hope that none will take umbrage if some seem far off the mark or others strike a little too close to home. They're never fully accurate. We're going to be looking at actually 5 generations of Americans, from the GI and the silent generations near the top of this, sometimes grouped together in so-called traditionalists, down to millennials. Alexis de Tocqueville said in his seminal work, Democracy in America, that each generation is a new people. Whether or not, though, there is such a thing as a generational persona is debated by sociologists. But in the view of some scholars, there are 4 archetypal generational personas, and each of these will be attached to each of the 4 generations. So let's turn and look at the first generation, the traditionalists, the grouping of the greatest and the silent generation, whose very lives were shaped and footed in the Depression and World War II. The seminal question, which I'll pose for each of these generations, begins with theirs. Where were you on D-Day? And how did you learn about D-Day? You likely learned about it gathered in your living room around a wooden family radio. A third of these Americans lived on farms, and many in multi-generational households. Spousal and parent-child relationships were narrowly defined. Tom Brokaw, the author of The Greatest Generation, said of this group, they were people of towering achievement but modest demeanor. Their character traits include duty to nation, to church, to job. Institutional commitment was very high to marriage and to employers. And respect for institutional authority was also very, very strong. Their leadership and decision-making style, though, was paternalistic and control-oriented. We'll see why a little bit later, but it has shaped this generation's approach to estate planning. I turn next to my own generation, the boomer generation. It has been entering retirement for the last few years at the rate of 10,000 individuals per day. 10,000 boomers turn 65 every single day through now till 2030. It's a group referred to by one commentator, without much affection, as the Woodstock generation. This was our coming out party. He described them, and I will quote, "They are not thrifty, they are uncomfortable with accountability, they're inclined to blame others for their own mistakes, but they are technologically literate, they stand to inherit vast wealth, and they know how to Google Ayers Inc. The aging of this generation will have a profound effect on our population demographics. United States Census Bureau data indicate that in 2000, there was 16.3% of our population below the age of 65. By 2025, that percentage will raise to 24.2%. This generation is shaped by the 1960s turbulence, by the Vietnam War, and by tragic political events, including a presidential assassination that shaped their sense of who they were. They learned about it not on a radio, but in a television, often in a grainy black and white picture. The parental model for this generation is evolving. The burgeoning institutionalization of food preparation, both canned and frozen food, allow women modest increases in time and autonomy. Children still know that adults are in charge, but strict obedience is giving way to accommodation, particularly by the 1960s. Some of their character traits include some of these features. And political commentators, social commentators, some of them attribute today's highly polarized political environment to our upbringing. We choose sides. When we grew up, there were communists and capitalists. There were good guys and bad guys. Institutional authority enjoyed a brief period of prominence, but it was utterly and sometimes violently rejected in the turbulence of the 1960s, and then re-embraced as boomers understood that institutionalism in a capitalistic society could mean you could make money. Parental control was giving way to consensus. Generation X, Gen X, is the first generation to grow up increasingly in two-career households. Sadly, dramatic increases in divorce rates are one of their defining characteristics. It's the first generation where technology of the binary type begins to take a foothold in the household. It's also the first generation of latchkey kids, owing to the fact that their households will dual-income households. They came home, they let themselves in the house, they went to the fridge, got a gallon of milk, they got a cookie, and they sat down, and when they looked at the milk carton, what did they see? They saw a picture of a missing child. Rapid technological change and significant changes in the relationship between parents and children lead to the fact that adults must now start to learn from their children. The character traits of this generation, again, generally speaking, include skepticism and suspicion of organizations, governance, institutions, and authority. Their decisions rest upon a kind of functional and necessary independence and pragmatism. And having watched their parents' work-life imbalance, the issue and the role of work in relationship to life is very important for this generation. Let's turn now to the millennial generation. I need to express a caution. I am the father of 3. I'm an employer of more, and so I may be perhaps subject to a selection bias. But the millennials are a remarkable generation and shaped by extraordinary forces. They witnessed 9/11. They helped elect President Obama. They are the first generation of so-called digital natives, and the first generation to grow up in a much broader array of household structures. While both of their parents typically worked, greater flexibility in work arrangements meant that millennials were less likely to be latchkey kids. Raised by parents who are described, and I quote, as having biological instincts in overdrive, leading to the other moniker, helicopter parents. College deans sometimes say that the hardest part of freshman orientation now is not getting the students to stay, it's getting the parents to leave. The character traits of millennials include high self-esteem. Sometimes we've heard the phrase that every one of them got a trophy. But I think it's important to point the trophy finger back at us because, of course, it was boomers who were giving them the trophies. They have an albatross of student loan debt, and they have higher levels of employment since the economic turbulence of 2008. Our retired chief economist, Paul Casrill, once was asked, "Paul, how do you define full employment?" Paul paused and he said, "That's when both of my kids have a full-time job." They are also described as a post-racial, post-gender generation. We'll look at that in just a little bit more. So how long are these generations likely to live? Here we see the longevity of the United States population stretching back to 1900. Early on, reductions in infant mortality, and then accompanied by the introduction of antibiotics in the 1930s and the 1940s, followed by improved diets and lower levels of smoking, have led to the place that we're in 2015. An American female can expect to live to the age of 81.2. An American male, 76.3. And in a fascinating comparison of the last 118 years, a 20-year-old today is more likely to have a living grandmother than it was for a 20-year-old to have a living mother in 1900. So let's turn and begin to look at some of the family demographics that are the result of these generational attributes. The first is a dramatic change in the composition of U.S. households. The top blue line represents the number of married couples. It was nearly 80% of households in the 1950s, and it has recently dipped below 50%. The fastest growing segment in our population is unmarried heterosexual couples, either without children, the top blue section, or with children. Today, adults between the ages of 18 and 29, 18% of them are married on average. But in 1960, that same group of 18 to 29-year-olds, 59% were married. The number of cohabiting adults who are age 50 and older has increased 75% in the last 10 years, drawn from Pew Research data. Men's and women's marital status reflect the decreasing preference for marriage. Here we see the top line is those who are married, the middle, the yellow line, never married, orange, divorced, and the blue at the bottom, widowed. Same data for the cohort of women. If and when they do marry, both men and women are older, typically. There's a correlation between educational level and marriage postponement, but you can see how the age at first marriage tends to be rising, certainly over the last 30 or 40 years. Young marrieds today are far more likely to marry someone of a different race and ethnicity, and this trend tends to skew westward in the United States, to the western states, and particularly in Hawaii, which has the highest rates of intermarriage. But out of all of this, sociologists would suggest that the paradigm of marriage is changing in fundamental ways. It's increasingly deferred or even bypassed by heterosexual couples, but embraced by same-sex couples following recent United States Supreme Court decisions. For traditionalists and boomers, marriage is seen as a cornerstone experience. After dating, couples married, they then lived together, and then they had children, and finally may have achieved some level of financial stability. But for Gen Xers and Millennials, marriage is increasingly a capstone experience. They date, they're likely to live together, they may attain some financial security, then they have children, and then marriage might follow that, again, as a capstone experience. A teenager in the United States today has less chance of being raised by both biological parents than in any other country in the world. While the United States Supreme Court has continued to recognize marriage as both a basic civil right and an institution central to our human existence, as seen in these two quotes, first from the case of Loving versus Virginia, the second, the more recent Obergefell versus Hodges. There's a growing group of sociologists and a few law professors who regard marriage as a declining and indeed, in their words, an unimportant institution. But even the American public is moving toward this view. 2010, a Pew Research survey, 39% of Americans and 44% of millennials say that marriage is becoming obsolete. This perspective has gained ground notwithstanding the extraordinary deference to and benefits of marriage legally. On this chart, you see a quotation, actually, from Obergefell versus Hodges. The Supreme Court cited 14 of these benefits in its 2015 decision. And in 2004, the United States Government Accountability Office indicated through a research study that there were 1,138 provisions of federal law which treat a relationship between two people who are married differently from any other relationship. So how are these generational attributes and relationship trends affecting family structures? Well, here's a snapshot of what a prototypical American family looked like statistically in the 1950s, a married heterosexual couple with 3 biological children. But wait, it's actually not that family, it's a contemporary family. This photo appeared in a recent issue of Costco Connection magazine. And I must admit, I'm a card-carrying Costco member. But in the era of internet dating apps, I didn't know that many were still meeting their spouse at the warehouse club. And these are some of the things that they found. And perhaps most importantly, the wife is quoted in the magazine of saying she found her Kirkland signature brand husband at Costco. Notwithstanding Costco's delight with such committed customers, a married couple with 3 children, the 1950s most common, is actually now 7th on the list of American households. What you see here is a visualization of a fascinating study done in 2016 based on the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. And in that, the study identified 10,276 different household types in the United States. First of them, and the most prominent, is a single individual. Second, a married couple. These are going up from left to the right and top. Third, a married couple with 1 child. And fourth, a married couple with 2 children. Somewhere buried in the data is retired colleague of mine, Don Omens, who was a federal estate tax return reviewer. Some of you may have known Don. Don and his wife had 17 biological children. I think that's down there perhaps at 10,275. Here we see a traditionalist family. The greatest generation had traditional family structures. They had 3 children typically, and if divorce occurred in traditional families, it was usually after the children were raised. If there was a so-called second act, it was often by the husband, who was statistically likely to marry a younger spouse. This phenomenon was one of the rationales behind the introduction of so-called qualified terminable interest property, or QTIP, trusts. The mortality statistics indicated that husbands would generally predecease their wives, and husbands feared that their wives, upon remarrying, would divert family assets to the new spouse. But for the traditional generation, the statistics didn't prove out the fear. For widowed women, 8% of them on average remarried, and it was generally 8 years after the loss of their first spouse. For men, 20% remarried, but they only waited 4 years to do so. For boomers, earlier divorces have been more common. They hold more salutary view about the impact of divorce on children. There's less social stigma. A frequent result is remarriage and blended families. 1/6 of American children are growing up today in blended families, and 40% of Americans have 1 or more step relatives. The United States Supreme Court's decision, 2013, U.S. v. Windsor, striking down DOMA, 2015, Obergefell versus Hodges, guaranteeing the right to marry, assured same-sex marriage for all Americans, with the possibility of second-parent adoption of children born to either spouse. Views of marriage and family structure have actually undergirded a new trend towards so-called 3-parent families, where following a divorce, a second spouse can be granted parental rights in some states, either as a so-called de facto parent, which recognizes, for example, it's recognized by statute in California, or even third-parent adoption, where the former spouse, the biological parent, does not need to relinquish parental rights. This status is recognized judicially, at least in Minnesota and the province of Ontario. This trend was chronicled in a New York Times article in 2012. Trends in artificial reproductive technology also make single parenting possible. There's a support group founded in New York in 1981 by a woman named Jane Mattis called Single Mothers by Choice. Some single parents are choosing to enter into so-called co-parenting arrangements. A website founded in 2012 called Modamily helps match people interested in co-parenting, and last counted had over 20,000 members. One proponent, a child psychologist, George Sachs, says, and I quote, "This co-parenting process removes many of the mysteries of how your child will be raised," unquote. Another, Jane Mattis, the founder of the website Single Mothers by Choice, says, and I quote, "It's really difficult to co-parent when you're madly in love with somebody, so it's more complicated when you don't have that bond." And here's a man and a woman who met on Modamily. They're chronicled in a New York Times office in 2013, and at least as of that timing of that article, I don't know whether or not they went ahead to co-parent and sire a child together. Striking advances in artificial reproductive technology now permit banking of reproductive material, making even posthumous reproduction possible. Storage of gametes and embryos, usually undertaken as either a precautionary measure in advance of disease or military service, or perhaps in connection with some other phenomenon, lead to the possibility of posthumous reproduction. State laws are by no means uniform regarding the inheritance rights of these posthumous children. I need to pause before showing the next slide by telling a story. I was with Stephen Lash, Chairman Emeritus of Christie's, a couple of years ago as I was starting this research. I was telling him a little bit about this, and he said, "Let me tell you a story." And a friend of Stephen's, who was a headmaster of a K-8 school somewhere in the Northeast, had a habit in the fall of welcoming the incoming class and sitting down with each of the children individually to introduce himself to welcome that child into the community. And one of his questions always was, "Tell me a little bit about your family." And so with the one little girl, I'll call her Susie, he said, "Susie, do you have any siblings?" And she said, "No, but I have 5 Diblings." And he thought, what is a Dibling? But of course he didn't say this to her, so later in the day, he approached her teacher and said, "Susie has 5 Diblings. What's a Dibling?" Here's what a Dibling is. It is a descendant of one male genetic donor who is then related by blood, either half-blood or whole blood, to a number of other siblings. They get together for play dates, they share birthdays, they may meet at parental anniversaries, who knows. Chronicled in a New York Times article, again from 2012. This one about the process of discovering whether or not you have donor siblings or Diblings. New family structures with children are enabled in part by extraordinary advances in reproductive technology. There are presently 15 variables, including in the last 18 months the possibility of using a so-called hybrid egg produced with something called spindle nuclear transfer technique. So there has now been a child born in the United States who is genetically the descendant of 3 parents. Here are the most recent statistics in the United States. I'm updating those in Bruce Stone's excellent materials from Heckerling a couple of years ago. There are about 230,000 artificial reproductive cycles each year, leading to 61,000 live births, 73,000 infants because of the preponderance of twins and triplets with these methods. There are 1 million embryos estimated to be in storage in the United States, and 1.5% of children are born annually conceived by artificial reproductive technology. And of course, where there's a new technology, there's going to be a new website and a new capitalist opportunity. Here I show a California company called California Conception's Donor Embryo Program, which has an embryo creation clinic. They purchase genetic material from donors, they then create embryos, and they offer these for sale to individuals for $12,500 for 3 tries and a money-back guarantee. This diversity of American family structures leads Paul Taylor, the author of The Next America, to say, families now come in all shapes, sizes, and constellations. Here then, let us step back and say, how do they array themselves in the United States? A third of them, 31%, are households without children. 35% are traditional, heterosexual married couples with children. 34% are modern households. And in a striking survey response, 70% of that latter group, 70% of modern families, when surveyed, say that when they approach financial planning, estate planning, and financial services, they expect to receive solutions that are suited to the top two groups, but not to their own. So how will our engagement with contemporary families evolve to ensure that their wealth management, their wealth transfer goals will be achieved? The implications of these changes have often overwhelmed me in the last year or two. Much good work is already being done in your practices, in the committees of the college. I offer a few observations and indeed many questions about the implications of these changes in the sections which will follow. First, looking at the left-hand side of this slide, all of these changes have implications that I list in the right-hand side. How will these families allocate wealth? How will their trusts evolve? What are the implications of much longer lifespans? And last, how will these families collaborate and make decisions? Let's explore this first question by considering an even more basic one, the haves and the have-nots of estate planning, the testate and the intestate in the United States. There have been numerous studies across the United States, from consumer reports through academic studies, generally find Testacy levels in the 50 to 70% range in the United States. Here I show the results of one conducted in 2009 by Samford law professor Alyssa DeRusso. She surveyed 324 respondents across 45 states, finding that 68% of them had no will. About 20% of them had a will drafted by counsel, 11% practiced self-help, and 1% didn't even know. But a much more comprehensive review has been done by a longitudinal study at the University of Michigan, begun in 1990 under the auspices of the National Institute on Aging and the Social Security Administration. It is called the Health and Retirement Study. HRS surveys every 2 years 20,000 Americans age 50 and up on a wide range of issues relating to their health, their income, their production of and consumption of wealth in retirement. Participants span a broad range of attributes, socioeconomically, geographically, and racially. And one of the things they survey every 2 years is intestacy. In general, what they find, 42% of their respondents have no will at the time they are surveyed, and 38% will die without an estate plan in place. So much lower statistics than generally are found. But there's a striking correlation between three attributes and substantially higher levels of intestacy. First, families with stepchildren, 49% of these respondents do not have a will. And in families, tragically, where there has been a breakdown in a relationship with an adult child, cutoff, emotional cutoff for at least a period of a year, 59% of these individuals will not have a will. And last, sadly, divorce respondents, 62% do not have wills. So in an era when we're raising questions about where the subject will come for us to address era of much lower levels of taxation impact, I think it's an opportunity to join with the matrimonial bar in at least addressing one of these phenomena. The other two are going to require some sensitivity and creativity. I'll talk about that in a moment. But I think it's difficult for these groups, the step families, those with emotional cutoff, divorcees, to do this. Why is it difficult to undertake estate planning? I would suggest it's difficult because it's harder to answer estate planning's fundamental questions. They're the following. Who will inherit? Second, how much? Third, when should they receive it? Fourth, will we leave it outright or in trust? And fifth, who will step into our shoes? These are weighty questions for every client, suggest they're more challenging for the individuals on the prior page and for contemporary families. Now, economists have been intrigued for years by this issue of wealth allocation, and they're puzzled by the fact that families tend to allocate wealth equally among children of equal relationship. So they're concerned with the who of this, and their rational economic modeling would suggest that individuals would not generally leave wealth equally among collateral descendants. They've come up with 3 theories to justify their expectations. The first is called the altruist model, where they suggest that parents want to leave wealth in a way that equals things out among children of different means. The second, so-called exchange model, indicates that parents would leave wealth to compensate those who have cared for them, wealth in exchange for services. And the third, the evolutionary model, suggests that parents will leave wealth to children who are likely to beget grandchildren, funding for the production of heirs, so to speak. Some academic researchers, though, attribute equality in wealth allocation to a different phenomenon. They say that we are fearful about unequal distributions because of the risk of litigation. But fortunately, mother knows best. American mothers, when surveyed, respond by saying, and 92% of them say this, that they will leave their wealth equally to children. Questions about wealth allocation in the United States are possible, indeed possible, because of a central tenet of American law, that of freedom of disposition. Our clients are free to allocate their wealth along this spectrum in any way they wish, with only limited public policy restraints. Immigrants to the United States may find this a bit puzzling, a bit confusing. They may come to like this freedom. On the other hand, they may hew back to the countries of their origin and the cultural or legal or religious dictates for the disposition of wealth. But let me return to the family with which I began today's presentation. And what I didn't show on the early slides was the compression in age gaps between the members of this family. The father, the traditionalist, is only 15 years older than his boomer spouse, and she is only 15 years older than her stepchildren, his from the prior marriage, and they are roughly 15 years older than their half-siblings, the Millennials descended from the marriage. The wife is concerned in the planning process about the so-called traditional approach to deferring the children's inheritance until she has achieved mortality, the life and state and remainder construct. And of course, we're all familiar with that phenomenon today. But what she does and what she fears is that her stepchildren will see her as an impediment to her inheritance, and they will be frequently renting this movie on Netflix. The plan that arose out of many discussions with this couple combined lifetime gifts, accelerating the children's inheritance, with testamentary transfers to provide for the wife and the grandchildren. So they rejected the traditional life estate remainder construct of wealth transfer. But critically, this plan rests upon important conversations with the family. I would suggest they are crucial to its success. The children were advised that their lifetime transfers would constitute the entire amount of their inheritance, so they did not have to look through their stepmother. Now let's look then at the role of family dialogue in this process. The dispositions of wealth by the greatest generation were generally ones that precluded discussion about wealth and wealth transfer. These were things that we didn't talk about as a family. But for contemporary families today, the leading generation, boomers, they need and they want to discuss these issues, but they need help in the process. They did not have a model to follow, and they need our counsel to know how to have these kinds of conversations. We'll talk about this in just a few moments. The plan that we just saw for one wealthy, blended American family raises a host of issues, and I think will have general utility in planning for contemporary issues. From first, the adequacy of financial wealth, wealth sufficiency, to the advisability of working together to maintain a shared asset, such as this family's cottage. Issues this family faced and their advisors' approach suggest an evolution is underway in our approach to both estate planning and trust management. What are these approaches looking like? First, estate planning. Initially, a focus that may be less centered on transfer taxes in an era of dramatically increased transfer tax exemptions, one that is more oriented to family goals, in a tax-efficient manner. One that is less paternalistic and colloquial to a process that is more engaging and adaptable to family composition. One that is less singular and less colloquial to one that is more cognizant of cultural perspectives. And one that adds to its perspective on the balance sheet an enlarged understanding of each family and each family member's total wealth. Fiduciaries are encountering a similar paradigm shift, where the bottom boxes are the same, and the top would suggest that what has previously been and continues to be an unchangeable focus on grantor intent may be moving toward expressions of intent which are more aspirational and flexible. So I'd like to turn now to the design of trusts themselves. I think it's axiomatic to this group that trusts prescribe the ways in which financial wealth will be managed for beneficiaries by codifying grantor intent, of course, in a trust agreement, an agreement interpreted within its own four corners. The divide that trusts must navigate has always been large, but I would suggest that today it's even larger, owing to the changes and the differences in generational attributes. On the left side of this chart, the grantors, traditionalists, and boomers today, and the attributes of their beneficiaries, Gen Xers and millennials. Also, the changes in marital practices and family structures. The good news is that the divide is less constrained by the impact of transfer taxes. Let me start by thinking about the reasons why trust exists and how this finds expression in the trust agreement. Those of us who are in-house, fiduciary or trust counsel, see an awful lot of trust agreements, as you do as well. But rarely do we see trusts which explicitly state their purpose. Rather, we infer that purpose by reference to various provisions relating to the four basic elements of a trust: its custody, its administration, its management, and its distribution functions. That inference often leads to predictable conclusions. This is a Q-tip trust under 2056b7. Or this may be an ILET with crummy withdrawal provisions under 2514e. On a deeper level, though, what if grantors were encouraged and indeed equipped to communicate to both their fiduciaries and their beneficiaries about why they entrusted their financial capital to the trustees and for their beneficiaries? It leads to something that we call a statement of intent. And it's one that will also serve as fiduciaries who are familiar with the challenges of mediating the divide between grantor intent and beneficiaries navigate that divide. That divide is sometimes substantial enough that it leads to attempts to terminate trust. And of course, it leads to many conflicts in the administration of trusts. The early termination of a trust is permissible as long as it doesn't run afoul of a trust's so-called material purpose. This harkens back to 1889, the Massachusetts case that has led to the so-called Claflin Doctrine. The Claflin Doctrine has found ample expression in the provisions of the Uniform Trust Code, and the material purpose serves as the subject, which must be identified for a number of actions under the UTC. But what could we gain if material purpose were less a matter of inference and one more of explicit expression? This is the concept behind a statement of intent. And this statement has two audiences in mind. First, the trustee. Communication to the trustee that is first neither an external letter of wishes, which are involved in practice outside the United States, but increasingly within the United States, but it is also not internal precatory language. Rather, it's language within the trust document itself, and it expresses the grantor's unique personal rationale for that trust's purpose. It also addresses the grantor's views on the lifespan of the trust and speaks to the fiduciaries responsible for exercising various discretionary powers. And today, in a period of reallocation of fiduciary responsibility, there are often more than one. And one set in particular, that of trust protectors, as they exercise latent powers that may lie decades in the futures. What will guide them in the exercise of those powers? I suggest that a statement of intent can be an excellent source of guidance. The second, and perhaps equally as important audience, is the trust beneficiaries themselves. It's easy to forget that trusts are a form of communication, and indeed often the last communication from a grantor. How many times have we seen beneficiaries thumbing through a trust agreement, and the cynic in us would say, we know what they're looking for. They're looking for their name and a dollar sign after it. But I think some of them are looking for something else. They're looking to ascertain whether or not the grantor said something to me. We must remember that there are no two-way conversations at the cemetery. A statement of intent offered to beneficiaries is neither an ethical will, that's something outside the trust document that conveys family values, nor is it a family mission statement. Rather, this statement of intent speaks to the why of family wealth held in trust, providing insights about family values and expressing hopes for the beneficiaries yet to come. We, of course, cannot author these, but we can encourage our clients to do so. A good resource, a recent article in Trust and Estates magazine by Raymond Odom, The Gold Standard of Estate Planning, talks about these statements and offers this paragraph as an example of a statement of intent. Statements of intent are especially important in this era of perpetual trusts, made possible, of course, by the widespread repeal of the rule against perpetuities, recently refueled by the doubling of gift and GST tax exemptions. Trusts on the right-hand side of this spectrum will speak to multiple generations of beneficiaries, many of whom will never have met their grantor. And that audience of beneficiaries will grow ever larger. We began a study in 2011 looking at asset growth in trust portfolios, trust design and distribution history, taxation of trust earnings, and last, family growth. Several colleagues who participated in formulating this study are in the audience today. And we particularly focused on family growth by looking at the total fertility rate in the United States. And today, it's just shy of 2, as we'll see in a chart in a few moments. By the 5th generation of this family, their perpetual trust would have 28 living beneficiaries. And if the trust were to last as long as one of our clients hoped, in an irrevocable dynasty trust he established in the late 1990s, intended to run for 600 years. That seems unimaginable. But in 600 years, the 20th generation of this family would give birth to 524,288 beneficiaries. That trust is looking more like a multi-employer pension plan. Trust designed to run past the rule will have to have very thoughtful set of beneficial interests, all arrayed on this chart, from mandatory income distributions to withdrawal rights to powers of appointment, all the things, the so-called bells and whistles, which are vitally important to the beneficiaries of every trust. The standards which govern discretionary distributions are, of course, the heart of a trust. And while they span a continuum from the very narrow on the left, that of emergencies, to the very broad on the right, pleasure, the distinction between ascertainable and non-ascertainable standards has fulfilled an important purpose in insulating trustee beneficiaries from the risk of estate tax inclusion. But at what cost? Informal surveys that we've done with lawyers would indicate that there is a higher use of ascertainable standards than necessary. And fiduciaries, when trying to cope with new circumstances, new family structures, things they could not anticipate, welcome broader standards of discretion to give them greater flexibility in achieving the purposes of the trust for new generations of beneficiaries. A final observation on substantive trust design, that of spray or sprinkle trusts. I would suggest that for modern families, spray trusts have limited compatibility. We all understand their advantages. They permit unequal but equitable distributions. There are efficiencies in the commingling of assets. They're very useful for minor beneficiaries of the same degree. But they present fiduciaries with multiple challenges. They present them with competing fiduciary duties where the fiduciary is held to confidentiality as to each beneficiary, but a duty to provide information to all beneficiaries. And they sometimes present insurmountable difficulties in building a trust portfolio which is well suited to each beneficiary's unique risk tolerance and marginal tax rate. I have a simple rule of thumb about spray trusts. If beneficiaries can't live together in the same house, they shouldn't live together in the same trust. We all know that there's a wide range of general trust provisions, usually based upon standard form language. I suggest that these provisions in trust would benefit from reevaluation when drafting trusts for modern families. Let me just highlight one or two. First, the administration of a trust during the period when a grantor becomes disabled. Some would say it is the most difficult period in fiduciary administration and management. Management of a trust during that phase is often one where dependents seem to incarnate themselves spontaneously. And the question is, how do we determine whether or not they're really dependent? And does the trust agreement allow us the latitude to either recognize them or exclude them in a way that's consistent with the reshaping of the American family and its relationships? Is that standard clause aligned with each grantor's unique intent, family, and support circumstances? And second, prudent investing. The Prudent Investor Act, which was promulgated in 1994, could not possibly anticipate the developments in socially responsible investing. But beneficiaries, particularly millennials, are increasingly interested in and strongly devoted to this ethical aspect of investing, and they expect their trustees to do so in their own trusts. So let me close this topic with some imagery about the role of trustees, and a somewhat, geometric attempt to portray some of these weighty issues. In days gone by, the trustee role seemed relatively straightforward. The grantor at the top expressed grantor intent through the trust agreement, endowing upon the trustee a set of fiduciary responsibilities for whom they were supposed to exercise these two sets of beneficiaries to whom they owed duties, the current and the remainder beneficiaries. But so much has changed. On the upper left-hand side, fiduciary responsibility is being reallocated broadly, pursuant to statutes such as administrative or directed trustee statutes, the most recent of which was promulgated by the Uniform Law Commission. On the upper right-hand side, there's an increasing array of statutory powers, discretionary powers granted by statute, which trustees may exercise in order to adapt their trust to wide-ranging and changing circumstances. And at the bottom, trust documents which grant trustees broad powers to fundamentally alter much of what their trust's original design was intended to do. That fiduciary domicile looks suspiciously like a mystical pentagram. Fortunately, it's only a hexagram. There are 3 points of fiduciary obligation, 3 sources of fiduciary authority. But the complexity of this alignment is much needed as trustees navigate a period of vast demographic change. This more complex fiduciary landscape arches over what seems to be an inexorable trend, increasing life expectancies of both grantors and their beneficiaries. Recall this prior chart on life expectancy. The trend, clearly upward, poses several extraordinary challenges. The first, how and by whom will our elderly be cared for? Throughout history, elders have been cared for in family intragenerational systems. The challenge is that globally, there are not enough younger family members who are going to be around to either provide that care directly or subsidize it through transfer payments to government systems which finance the costs of elder care. What we see here are the rates of younger children and older people. The top line, the red line, is that of those who are beneath the age of 5, the green line bottom, 65 and older. This phenomenon is the result of very low levels of reproduction in Western Europe and Japan, and especially China with its disastrous one-child policy. It has led in China to a phenomenon known as an inverted family tree. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and 1 child. The phenomenon is so severe that Chinese parents are now allowed to take legal action against children if they fail to maintain contact or send money. Just write a check. The need for that care will be exacerbated by a rising incidence of dementia, which sadly accompanies longer lifespan. And we hear projections about the rates of dementia on the top low and middle income countries and the bottom high income countries. An intriguing aspect of this phenomenon of elder care is the difference in perspectives around the world about who should be responsible for the elderly. And what you see here is a list of countries and expressions of preference, and they're indicating that the elderly themselves should be responsible, that's the yellow bar, their families, the grayish bar, or the government, the bluish bar. In Pakistan, for example, 77% of respondents to surveys believe that elder care is a family responsibility. In South Korea, on the other hand, 53% say elders should take care of themselves. Russia, 63% expect the government to fulfill this responsibility. In the United States, 46% say the elders themselves are responsible for their own well-being, 20% say families, and 24% say government. We're fortunate in the United States that our reproduction, represented here in the red line by the total fertility ratio in the United States, while significantly lower than its peak in the late 1950s when it grew over the rate of 3.5 per woman, it's holding close to the replacement level. Only in the last couple of years has it dipped below 2 to about 1.8, 1.9 per woman. It's important to note, though, that this favorable reproduction data, these rates in the United States are driven significantly by 2 phenomena: immigration and immigrant reproduction. At current rates, 88% of United States population growth through 2065 will be driven by immigration and immigrant reproduction. Another way to look at this phenomenon of the relationship of elderly to other members of society is through the lenses of so-called dependency ratios that show the balance of older individuals to younger and middle-aged adults, and on the other hand, the balance of children to younger and middle-aged adults. What we see here on the left side is the so-called old age dependency ratio. Back in the 1950s, it was 12.8%. Again, the ratio of younger people to elderly. It dramatically increases, projected in 2050 going up to 35.5. In the middle, because of lower levels of reproduction, the child dependency rate is decreasing. And when the 2 of them are combined, we see total dependency statistics projected out through 2050 in the United States. But there is another solution. Technology entrepreneur and artificial intelligence researcher Martine Rothblatt says, and I quote, "Grandma and Grandpa need and deserve an attentive, caring, interesting person with whom to interact. The only such person who can be summoned into existence to meet this demand are manufactured software persons with robotic bodies. Empathetic, autonomous robots with a physicality that mimics a flesh and blood person," unquote. I don't welcome the notion of being cared for by a robot. There are some difficult implications out of this for boomers and their children. First, the economic and employment challenges of the last 10 years have brought many millennials back to the nest. Millennials, though, will have more than ample opportunity to return the favor as their parents retire and rely upon Social Security and Medicare, costs of which will increasingly be borne by the younger generation. Third, due to increasing lifespans and inadequate retirement savings, boomers will be living out that old bumper sticker that says, "I am spending my children's inheritance." And fourth, owing to widespread conversion of defined benefit pension plans to defined contribution plans, millennials will have to fund their own retirement. If they're fortunate to inherit something from their parents, from mom and dad, there's a decent chance that a good portion of it will be income in respect of a decedent. Before millennials receive these inheritances, though, they will have to see their parents through the difficulties near the end of their lives. We know that there is too often inconsistency between what the elderly wish in those last chapters of life and what actually transpires. We also know about the importance of advance directives and the critical role that they play in reducing that inconsistency. As lawyers, we see the conflict that arises from families who go through these decisions. There's little research on that kind of intrapersonal and intrafamily conflict, but what there is suggests that families drawn together around these difficult decisions about circumstances at the end of life and elder care, 40 to 70% of these families will be drawn into sustained interpersonal conflict. Why is this? Well, the first reason I think is fairly obvious. There's often a lack of discussion about these issues in families. These are very difficult issues to raise and discuss. And it's compounded by the increasing complexity of our families today. We have raised children to be independent. They have left the nest. They have migrated to different states. They have married others who then join the family. They may leave the faith tradition or join another faith tradition, and these issues bring them crashing back together to discuss and to decide these very weighty issues, and too often without instruction and without discussion. But this is a jury topic. There's a little good news for everyone in this room. Here we see the correlation between education level and cognition. So for all of us lawyers and all who hold advanced degrees, the good news is that the more education you have, the less cognitive decline you will experience throughout all stages of life. Hallelujah. And there's even better news from a National Institutes of Health survey. This is amazing. I will quote it. Mild drinking, as well as being overweight or obese, confers significant protection against dementia. Unquote. So at tonight's farewell dinner, let's raise a glass to that curious finding. Well, we've been exploring difficult topics. We need to lighten it up just a little bit. So let's talk about mortality. According to the psalmist, the length of our days is 70 years, or perhaps 70 years and 10, or perhaps 80. The person known to have lived the longest in recent history was a supercentenarian named Jean Calment. She died in France in 1997 at the age of 122. But fascinatingly, there is a group of Americans who are not interested in mortality, or shall I say they are interested in overcoming it. Let me group them into 4 categories. I call them evangelists, optimists, pessimists, and realists. Who are they? The evangelists are the so-called transhumanists. The optimists are the immortalists. The pessimists see the need for cryopreservation. And the realists are biologists and medical doctors. Here's a shot of transhumanist and U.S. presidential candidate Zoltan Istvan and his friends, who are driving their immortality bus around the country. And let me read you a quote from Zoltan himself. "I'm hoping that my immortality bus will become an important symbol in the growing longevity movement around the world. It will be my way of challenging the public's apathetic stance on whether dying is good or not. By engaging people with a provocative, drivable giant coffin, debate is sure to occur across the U.S. and hopefully around the world. The next great civil rights debate will be on transhumanism." Let me turn, though, to the immortalists. They are a different breed, highly intelligent, they have deep convictions, and they have extraordinary wealth. First, a couple of observations. Martine Rothblatt, again, the founder of SiriusXM, CEO and chairwoman of United Therapeutics, says, "Clearly, it is possible through technology to make death optional." Aram Sabeti, a technology guru out in Silicon Valley, "The proposition that we can live forever is obvious. Doesn't violate the laws of physics, so we will achieve it. And last, Dave Asprey, the CEO of Bulletproof. I decided I was just not going to die. So what are the potential outcomes? One group believes that we will overcome mortality, biological mortality, through DNA manipulation. DNA and mortality are just a coding problem. And once we've learned how to recode DNA, we will solve biological mortality. Another believes that humans will merge with artificial intelligence and transcend biological limitations. So what are some of the organizations behind this? Number one, the National Academy of Medicine, which has something called the Grand Challenge in Healthy Longevity, intended to award a $25 million prize for breakthroughs in longevity research. Another, the SENS Research Foundation. SENS is an acronym for Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. Unity Biotechnology, which is doing research on senescence, recently raised $116 million in capital for investors including Jeff Bezos and Peter Thiel. And last, Google, which launched its subsidiary Caligo in 2013 with $1 billion in funding. It's very secretive, but is believed to be performing research on the biomarkers of aging. Well, let's turn to the cryopreservationists. We need some pessimism. The pessimists believe that they may run out of time before solution to mortality is achieved. And of course, they will then have themselves cryopreserved. There are 4 organizations which provide these services worldwide. 2 of them, perhaps 3, are based in the United States, the Alcor Life Extension Foundation and the Cryonics Institute. Some countries, such as France, prohibit cryopreservation. So some people have their bodies shipped outside the country in order to find the right mix of liquid nitrogen. Here are 2 of them. They're both 501c3s founded in the 1970s. Each of them has about 150 patients in cryopreservation. And thinking about cryopreservation, if you choose to have this done, you're going to want to ensure that, number 1, you stay that way, and number 2, when you come back, you have some spending money. So we're seeing a rather steady stream of proposed cryopreservation trusts. And let me walk you through some language in these trust agreements. This is drawn directly from these trusts and only slightly modified to protect confidentiality. Generally, the purposes are to provide funding for cryopreservation and storage of so-called digital mind images. In other words, an image of one's mind, which supposedly at some point in the future will be able to be downloaded into a bionic person who will then have the mind of that predecessor. So one of these says that during cryopreservation, the grantor will no longer be living, but the grantor will nevertheless not be dead. On the distribution side, one of these trusts would permit distributions to the grantor's bionic analog version, or BAV. And he contemplates that if multiple BAVs of himself are restored, each is entitled to discretionary distributions, and each may live rent-free in any trust property. I think back, how many BAVs can you have living together? I hope that we're not managing spray trusts for those multiple BAVs. And last, on termination, these trusts are designed to terminate when the grantor is revived. And for one of these, the grantor says that the grantor may be revived in this world or another world. We have offices around the world, but we haven't yet contemplated placing one on another planet. And here from this one, upon revival, the grantor will be considered to be a different legal person. This grantor better hope that it's not more than 37 and a half years after his initial demise, or else he'll become his own grandpa. The last point on these trusts, our property law, our trust law, our tax law, our insurance law, are all designed for the living or the dead, but not the in-between. Let's come back to reality. Biologists, medical doctors who do not share the view of immortalists. Their best hope for this work and for our species, as they say, is not to extend lifespans, but to lengthen our years of healthy living, so-called improving health spans. Now, why have I taken us on this detour? Well, first, we needed a little break from all that dreariness. But I think, and I would suggest to you, that estate planning, our fundamental craft, rests upon the biological fact of mortality, and that fact, in turn, is grounded upon religious and theological tenets of every major world religion. We die because of some moral failure. And back in those charts, way back in those charts on each of the generations, one of those statistics was the rate of religious disaffiliation, increasing across the generations to the point today, for millennials, it's probably in the 35 to 40% range. And I have the concern that not too far in the future, there will be a group of potential clients who see no need for estate planning because they believe that they will live forever. Of course, until then, there are apps to keep you going digitally after you're gone. And here are just a couple. Twitter, Lives On, and something called Dead Social. Those are not on my iPhone. So I turn to the last section of this presentation. Given the extraordinary changes in the structure of families and the attributes of the individuals who inhabit these structures, how will today's families come together to make decisions that every family must make? Some of these decisions are really easy and enjoyable. The ones on the left side about birthdays and vacation plans. Are we going to go to Cabo or Cannes this year? But some in the middle are more challenging, relating to the management of foundations, shared assets, family businesses. Who gets to use the cottage over July 4th? How much should we allocate to impact investing? Do we fire Junior because he's violated our employment policy for the 5th time? And others, the ones on the right, are the most difficult ones we will face in our lives. Should we maintain mother's life support? These decisions on the far right side have always been and always will be difficult. But for many, in prior generations, they were made paternalistically. Today, though, the oldest generation must overcome the culture and habits of paternalism and maternalism if they want Gen Xers and millennials to be engaged. And to do so, families must move from the left side of this chart to the right side. And as counsel, fiduciary, and advisors, we are frequently called upon to help them bridge this gap. The dialogue surrounding family wealth today is changing. In the older generations, there was often no discussion about family wealth, but there were expectations and there were reactions. Boomers, though, are posing thought-provoking questions about wealth. What meaning will we derive from our wealth? How will our children oversee family enterprises and manage them? When and how should we discuss wealth with our children and educate them about its responsibilities? And on this question, we had a fascinating exchange several years ago, 8-10 years ago, at the Northwestern University Family Enterprise Institute. We welcomed 100 closely held business-owning families to a 2-day symposium on a number of issues that affect family business, succession, best practices, etc. But an ACTEC fellow and I had a panel presentation where we wanted to explore the qualitative aspects of these families and the role that financial wealth played in the families. Northwestern University had at the time this fabulous technology that gave every person a transponder where they could program in their generation, they could respond to questions. 2 of the questions we posed to the older generation, so they would have been traditionalists, and the responses to those 2 questions have always stuck with me. The first question we asked them was, at what age do you believe children should inherit the vast bulk of their financial wealth? We gave them the ages of 18, 21, 25, 30, and 35. They began to vote. The results came up on the screen, and we were stunned that 53% of them said age 21. 53% traditional entrepreneurs said age 21. Puzzling until we reflected and thought, perhaps this has the view of an entrepreneur. Because what is an inheritance? It's the transfer of entrepreneurial capital. 10 minutes later, we posed a related question that we wanted to separate from the first. And that question was, at what age should families begin to discuss inheritance with their children? We gave them the same ages, 18, 21, etc., up to 35. They began to vote, and this time, 56% said age 25. So give it first and talk about it later. Boomers, though, are interested in these conversations, and they're facing support responsibilities, and they covet advice on how to provide for elderly parents, dependent children, often at the same time, and in one of the most poignant issues we must address, the ongoing care for disabled adult siblings. I would suggest that 2 generations ago, an American born disabled would not have a normal life expectancy. 1 generation ago, that individual may have lived longer, but usually lived in an institutionalized setting. But today, these individuals have lived lives of relative independence under the watchful care of their parents. And as those parents age, how will they resolve the issue of who will provide that continuing care? Those in modern family structures also need more counsel on how to allocate their financial wealth to and among a more diverse group of beneficiaries. As Charlie Collier, author of Wealth and Families, has recognized, these issues and the family relationships they impact represent the greatest challenge for our families today. Charlie was the senior development officer at Harvard University, a much sought-after family advisor, and led for a number of years with Kathy Wiseman, a wonderful postgraduate training program at Georgetown University at the Bowen Center for Family Systems. He's an author, but sadly today sidelined by early onset Alzheimer's disease. Charlie is the individual whose concept of wealth suggested that we needed to enlarge our definitions to grow larger than the balance sheet. And indeed, when we discuss wealth, we usually think of only financial wealth. But in Charlie's view, families have 4 forms of wealth: the so-called personal wealth or human capital, family members' gifts and attributes; the professional wealth, how do family members learn, relate to each other, and achieve; on the bottom right, social capital or public wealth, how do families relate to their community through volunteerism, philanthropy, political involvement; and last, financial capital, the so-called pockets of wealth. How will financial wealth enhance and grow the other forms of family wealth? Well, each family's wealth is grounded in a unique set of values and aspirations. These find expression in various individual shared activities and practices. And to the extent that families work together and share responsibility for those aspects of their wealth, that upper left quadrant becomes increasingly important. So how can contemporary families lay the best foundation for their work together? I would offer a 5-factor approach. First, what's at stake? What kind of matter is at issue? Second, who are the members of our family? Third, who gets to be at the table? And fourth, what structures, if any in some cases, surround our decision-making on particular issues? And fifth, where does the buck stop? Let me expand the metaphor of the table with a brief story. I was working with a wealthy couple, a boomer couple, a few years ago, who had approached us. One of my colleagues who's here today will remember this engagement. We talked about their wealth, family worth $100 or $150 million at the time, around age 50, and the concerns they had about the impact of this wealth upon their millennial children, a prototypical concern. And as we did so, I talked a little bit about the work that we were doing in this area and offered to meet with them to talk about their concerns around that wealth. And so within a couple of weeks, the father called me and said, "We'd like to get together and speak with you about this." And he said, "I want to send you a little something to read." And a day later, what appeared in my inbox was a substantial PowerPoint presentation. Moses had been to the mountain, and he had received the revelation about wealth in his family. And so there was a 24-page deck that was full of his observations about capitalism and independence and all these things. And I thought to myself, I don't think the family had much to do with putting those 10 commandments together. But they talked about their concerns in sharing this information with their family. How would they do so? Where would they have this conversation, this vital conversation? And they said, should we have it in your offices? Should we have it in our lawyer's office? And I asked a simple question. I said, where do you have the most important conversations in your family? And they immediately said, we have them at our dining room table. And I said, that's where you have this conversation. They indeed went on to have that conversation, and it's led to, I think, a lot more functionality around the disposition of their wealth. But what I drew from that was this idea, this metaphor of the table at which these conversations occur. On the left-hand side, the study is the place where Dad in prior generations made his decisions. Mom and Dad may have made them at the kitchen table. The entire family may have gathered around the dining room table. And over to the right, as family issues and affairs become more complex, we move to the conference table and indeed the boardroom. As the family grows in size and intergenerational participation, as governance and decisions and decision-making structures become more formal, these must ensure alignment with family goals, fairness, conflict minimization, goals we all understand. But we mustn't forget, though, that many of the most personal issues that will be addressed draw us back to the dining room and the kitchen table. So the discussion and dialogue around these issues is family wealth in action. And I want to close with a story. I was fortunate to work with Charlie Collier 8 or 10 years ago with a family in the midst of selling a closely held business. And the father was wise to recognize that the sale of that business would be a seminal event within his family and their own well-being. And he asked the family to gather together around the holidays so that they could have a conversation about the impact of moving from a closely held business family to a family with liquidity and marketable assets. And Charlie Collier and I worked together with this family, and we met with them around their dining room table. On the first evening, we got acquainted and laid the foundation for what occurred the next day. And what occurred the next day has had a profound impact upon me. Charlie and I sat with this family in a conference room, a U-shaped table, as the mother and father, nicknamed the Lion and the Lioness by their 4 children, gathered around this table, and we simply turned to the father first, and we asked him, "Tell us a little bit about your family." And he began slowly at first, and mindful of the fact this is a family in the middle of selling a business. The father, a son-in-law who was the chief financial officer of the company, had their laptops at the meeting because they were in the middle of the deal. But what they were discussing at this meeting was just as important. And the father began again slowly to talk about his family as he moved up the family tree. And I realized as he was sharing the story of his family that the pencils had gone down, people were leaning in, and they were hearing important things. And as he went on, we were perhaps 45 minutes or an hour into this family storytelling. The father began to speak about an aunt up on the left-hand side, an aunt who'd had a particularly difficult life journey. And as he shared the difficulty of her life, he became overwhelmed and he broke down. And inside I thought, oh my gosh, we've goofed up here, we've gone off the rails. And Charlie, calm and cool, said, we've been at this for a while. We need to take a little break. So Charlie went out one door, I went out the other door. The lioness, whom I'd only met the first time, the day before, beelined after me. And she came up to me, and I don't tell this for the emotional poignance of the story, although it was very poignant. She was weeping. She grabbed both of my hands, and she said 2 things I have not forgotten. She said, "I have never heard these stories. And second, I have never seen this side of him." What was happening in that room? What was happening psychologically is they were exploring their family system. And they were using an age-old technique, as age is our race, the telling of stories, to understand who they are and how is it that their financial wealth will inform the well-being of their family for generations to come. So while the composition of the families we serve today is undergoing dramatic change, whatever the composition, each family is, of course, a group of individuals, individual human beings drawn together by love and by financial wealth, addressing the issues we all face during our mortality. And as do so, each of our clients, with each of them, we stand at the intersection of our heritage, in other words, our distinctive place among the generations of our family, and our legacy, our yearning that there might be something permanent from our labors. As counsel, as fiduciaries, we stand beside them and we guide them at this intersection of heritage and legacy. It is what some would call a liminal space, a threshold. And what a privilege it is and an honor as fellows of this college to accompany and guide these families at this intersection. Thank you.
This has been a special video presentation of ACTEC Trust and Estate Talk, a podcast series created for wealth and estate management professionals by the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel, or ACTEC, and funded by the ACTEC Foundation. For more information about the college and additional resources for professionals, visit actec.org.